It simply means that a man shall not say he knows or believes that which he has no scientific grounds for professing to know or believe." Unquote. Soft agnosticism, shall we say, is the mere absence of belief in God, or any deity, since it suspends judgment about matters of metaphysics and theology. The more epistemological position that Huxley may have had in mind is what is known as hard agnosticism. It is impossible to determine whether or not God exists. In either case, agnosticism neither confirms nor denies any epistemological claims about God, and thus it properly satisfies the status of being a default position. In a sense, the agnostic places phenomenological brackets around the propositions God exists and God does not exist, to explore uncharted areas of research that may offer insight toward reaching a conclusion. Despite the historical and philological difficulty with deviating from the roots of atheism and its mainstream approaches to it, perhaps we shall have to consider the matter open to the atheist who wears the label negative or positive atheist. In the spirit of charity, we may be forced to acknowledge against the most reliable and broadest understanding of atheism to include mere deniers of belief in any God in our casual encounters and dialogues. But it should not cause us to go astray from the conventional and usual meanings of the term from which many modern atheists have deviated. Number 2. Atheism and the burden of proof. When a viewpoint of a particular issue is said to shoulder the burden of proof, it means that the proponent who shoulders the burden must be the party to advance reasons in support of its affirmation. Deciding which side of an issue shoulders the burden of proof is not always easy to decipher, but there are some good indications that we can intimate. In their third edition to their popular logic textbook used in curricula throughout the United States, the authors Brooke Noel Moore and Richard Parker of California State University, Chico, make an instrumental observation with respect to identifying just who shoulders the burden of proof. Quote, "How do we know where the burden of proof should be equally shared by those on different sides of an issue? In general, we might think that the burden of proof should be equally shared by those on different sides of an issue, and there are times when that is indeed the proper way to distribute it. But such equal sharing is not always appropriate. In most cases, the initial plausibility of the claim itself determines whether the burden of proof should fall more on those who advance a claim or on those who object to it." Unquote. With respect to the one who advances an affirmative position, such as theism, Moore and Parker write, quote, "In some cases, too, the burden of proof falls automatically on the person taking the affirmative side of the issue. When there is conflict, generally the initial plausibility principle wins out. If the issue is whether you will die someday, then the burden is on the person who takes the negative side and says that you will not, since the claim that you will not is most implausible." Unquote. Not too many critically thinking philosophers disagree with this rule of thumb for placing the burden of proof on deserving sides of issues. It seems to comply rather coherently with this idea of initial plausibility. And if one consult what Flew says about the presumption of atheism, one will notice that he admits that, in the end, any statement can be converted into a positive or negative claim anyway. So the positive or negative distinction is not entirely helpful. But what is disturbing is that Moore and Parker have since revised this section to be a little bit more conducive to those atheists who perceive that all positive claimants automatically shoulder all of the burden of proof. In their sixth edition, after introducing the notion of initial plausibility, they write, quote, "Other things being equal, the burden of proof falls automatically on those supporting the affirmative side of an issue rather on those supporting the negative side. This rule applies to cases of existence versus non-existence too. Most often, the burden of proof should fall on those who claim something exists rather than on those who claim it does not." Unquote. So Moore and Parker are now implying that atheism is much weightier, not to mention most statements of non-existence, if not the default position, prior to any investigation into the matter. According to this statement, theists will most often shoulder the burden of proof. What is curious here is the phrase, other things being equal. If this phrase implies the criterion of initial plausibility, then the affirmative or negative distinction is irrelevant. If the phrase implies the stipulation that certain circumstances associated with the claim's context decide the relevancy of the affirmative or negative distinction, then this criterion is vacuously true, for it now tells us that the burden shifts when the burden should shift. Upon further reading of Moore and Parker's book, the latter seems to be implied when they write, quote, "Sometimes getting at the truth is not the only thing we want to accomplish, and on such occasions we may purposely place the burden of proof on a particular side. Courts of law provide us with the most obvious example. One important variety of special circumstances occurs when the stakes are especially high. For example, if you're thinking of investing your life savings in a company, you'll want to put a heavy burden of proof on the person who advocates making the investment." Unquote. In this context, the theist is not let off the hook, for she now possesses the initial burden of proof unless atheism can be shown to be a circumstance where the stakes are especially high. The general conclusion one is to draw from Moore and Parker's revision is that in addition to positive claims of great import, most positive claims are to automatically shoulder the burden of proof. The inference from this is that theism will shoulder the burden of proof because the burden of proof especially belongs to positive claimants in cases of existence versus non-existence. As a confessing theist, I would certainly find this conclusion unsavory to my own approach on the subject. Fortunately, I do not have to make irrational pleas for Moore and Parker's contention to be overturned. Well-informed sources are more careful to think in terms of Moore and Parker's third edition rather than in terms of their sixth. It is possible, given the high epistemic status granted to non-existent things, to summarize Moore and Parker's sixth edition statements by the maxim, quote, "Absence of evidence is evidence of absence." Unquote. It might interest the reader to know that the late atheist Carl Sagan himself made an opposite maxim, that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, in his book, The Dragons of Eden. It needs to be noted here that there are counterexamples to the Moore-Parker position that most affirmative claims, presumably the ones where initial plausibility cannot be assessed, shoulder the burden of proof. For example, if I said there are no Jeps in the JOP, it is not clear that this is a priori more likely to be true than there are Jeps in the JOP. In this example, I have intentionally used nonsense words to represent a situation of ceteris paribus, all things being equal. And the initial plausibility criterion will not be particularly helpful here, even if Jeps and JOPs are cognitively meaningful tokens that refer to things we happen to be unfamiliar with. But there is clearly something strange in suggesting that the positive claim about there being Jeps in the JOP shoulders the burden of proof, and its negation, there are no Jeps in the JOP, does not. So I really do not think that the Moore-Parker maxim is to be haphazardly preferred over Sagan's maxim. Now, there surely are situations where the absence of evidence is evidence of absence maxim may enjoy some warrant in the right circumstances. If I said that there is a boulder in the middle of the lobby in the Library of Congress, then someone's failure to observe a boulder in the lobby of the Library of Congress would constitute grounds for there not being one. But if someone said that there is a grain of sand in the middle of the lobby of the Library of Congress, then, if an observer claimed to not have observed the grain, would not constitute sufficient grounds for rejecting the existence of the grain of sand in the lobby. Well, the difference between the two situations is that an absence of evidence for the boulder's existence constitutes evidence of absence because we should expect to see evidence where there is none. The grain of sand is clearly more elusive than a boulder, and so an absence of evidence would be expected even if there really is a grain of sand in the middle of the lobby.